Today we're going to talk about a book which is a story of two world wars, a disease which over the centuries killed millions of people, breakthrough scientific achievements, and two brave, outstanding scientists and many other extraordinary people. The book is called The Fantastic Laboratory of Dr. Weigl, How Two Brave Scientists Battled Typhus and Sabotaged the Nazis. And the author, Arthur Allen, is with me right now. Hello, Arthur. Thank you so much for joining me today. Arthur Allen is a science correspondent for KFF Health News, and he's the author of not just this book, Vaccine, the controversial story of medicine's greatest lifesaver, was your first book, your previous book, I understand, before Dr. Weigl.
Yes, that's right. Mm-hmm. And I also wrote a book about tomatoes.
Tomatoes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, today we're going to talk about this story, a story which is at times heartbreaking and tragic, but also truly inspiring and fascinating. And I would like to sort of start from the end and ask you, how did you gather the material for this book? How did you come up with an idea of writing a book about two Polish scientists?
Yes. Well, when I was writing my vaccine book, I had a few pages about efforts to find a typhus vaccine during World War II. The vaccine book was mostly focused on American researchers and scientists and vaccination programs. And so I only dipped my toe into it. But it did lead me to both Ludwik Fleck and Rudolf Weigl as very interesting scientists. And eventually I kind of circled back around to learn about them and just thought that it was a fascinating story. It's really two stories, but they are related. And the two scientists had a relationship, had worked together and had sort of parallel experiences during both wars, actually, World War I and World War II.
So in a few words, who was Rudolf Weigl and who was Ludwik Fleck?
So Weigl was the older of the two. He was born in 1880s, I think.
I think, yes.
80, mm-hmm. Yeah. And, sorry. He was actually of sort of, I guess, German descent or blood, as the Germans would say. And he was born in what's now the Czech Republic, but was quickly, was educated in Lviv, which was, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then worked for the Austro-Hungarian Army's medical sanitary services during World War I. And he actually was trained in zoology. In fact, people have criticized the title of my book because he wasn't a doctor in the sense of a medical doctor. He was a zoologist. And but so he quickly, during World War I, they all became very absorbed in the pursuit of some kind of protection from typhus. Just before the war, a French scientist had sort of confirmed that typhus was spread by lice, which were, these vermin, which, it's very common nowadays for children to have head lice.
Yes.
But they're a slightly different organism than body lice. And luckily for us, because head lice don't carry these very dangerous diseases like typhus and trench fever, as it's called, and other diseases. So typhus is really a disease that occurs in very dire circumstances, where people are wearing the same clothes constantly because body lice live in your clothes. And then they jump off your clothes and feed on your body. And with that, they're excrement actually, contains can contain these bacteria, typhus bacteria or others, and so there have been great. The typhus was a sort of an endemic disease. It was a regular occurrence in many cities in before, going back to probably the 16th century or earlier, but it really would break out in huge epidemics during times of war and great hardship when people were freezing and undernourished and living, in close proximity in the same clothes for long periods of time.
Yeah, you even at some point you write typhus corresponds with social collapse.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Mm-hmm. So when you read the accounts of the post, the Russian revolutionary period, and the years after that, are sort of the most striking example that you can read contemporaneously. Although there was also typhus in Napoleon's army coming back from Moscow, which they invaded in whenever that was, early 19th century, and they've found traces of it in DNA in the bones of some of these soldiers buried along the way. But in Russia at that time, and also in the Ukraine, and in Poland, sort of at World War I, by this point, the public health community knew that the disease was spread by lice, and so there was more of a concerted effort to delouse people. In World War I, there's almost any book you read about the battlefront, the front lines in World War I, you hear accounts of delicing, of soldiers sort of picking the lice out. So I'm going on. I could go on for a long time about that, but
But producing a vaccine was a huge challenge. Why was it such a huge challenge to microbiologists to come up with methods of producing an effective vaccine against typhus?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And, so that up to when we're talking about this period of World War I, vaccines there were some very new efforts to make vaccines. There had been a smallpox vaccine, which was a very specific way of producing it, which was that you basically scraped off, you grew it on cows and used their this material, and then they were starting to develop bacterial vaccines by growing the bacteria sort of in different kinds of soup, if you will, and they tried to do that with typhus, but it turns out they didn't really understand at this time. But typhus is an intracellular organism, so it lives inside the bacteria. Inside cells in a way that is a codependent way. So you can't really just take a bunch of typhus germs and throw them into a soup and they multiply to make something which you could then, neutralize, as was the common practice, and with sort of things like whooping cough or diphtheria or tetanus germs, which were other bacterial germs that had vaccines fairly early, starting in this early 20th century. And so it was very difficult to make it. And it was Weigl who, there were two approaches by the end of by World War II. One was the Weigl approach, and one was growing it in eggs, which seemed to work fairly well. And that was the approach done in the U.S. But Weigl, had this idea that since the organism of typhus only lived in lice and people, it didn't have any other animal hosts, although now there may be other animal hosts like squirrels and things, but it was very rare. The main places that it grew were in people and lice. So he said, well, basically, I'm going to create louse farms. And how do you create a louse farm? Well, lice, body lice, exist by feeding on people. So the farm is people. And so he established these laboratories. He did it very painstakingly and slowly, and he was very nervous about releasing his vaccine in a way because he was worried about safety issues and the things that scientists generally, good scientists, worry about, but he was extremely careful. But he developed this, and there were this whole idea of louse feeders, people who would sit around with these sort of matchbox-sized cages. I have pictures in my book that had little screens, and the louse would be strapped to people's legs or sometimes arms, and the lice would feed through these screens and nourish themselves. And then he had to contaminate the lice with typhus somehow, so that with the idea that the typhus germs would multiply in the bodies of the lice, and then you could harvest the lice, so to speak, and their intestines, where the bacteria were multiplying, could be then neutralized with formalin or other chemical substances, so they didn't actually give you typhus, but rather would provoke an immune response. And incredibly painstaking. Weigl was what we would call a sort of a DIY genius. I mean, he developed all this machinery that really only applies to the production of typhus vaccines. But it involved, these little cages, a little automated way of pushing air, using a high pressure system to push a tiny amount to under a microscope, observe a needle going into the anus of a louse, and then injecting this little bolus of typhus sort of slurry into them so that it would then grow. And it's incredibly sort of sensitive, difficult, painstaking, and, expensive, really, way to make this vaccine. But it appeared to be the most effective vaccine by the time World War II broke out.
Yes, you actually quote a very funny dialogue between Rudolf Weigl while he was still working in Przemysl, as far as I remember, under Philipp Eisenberg, who was his boss. And Eisenberg was skeptical, and he said, "Tell me, sir, where are you going to get the cultures? You won't have access to the typhus organism until you have patients, and you won't get patients when there is no disease. So how is this going to work?" Weigl thought for a moment and then, with characteristic earthiness, replied, "Well, if we can get the louse to eat the germs, we will stick them up its ass." So this is one of the funnier moments when we read the story.
No, it's really pretty incredible. This whole very sort of, we would call it like a Rube Goldberg scheme. I mean, just, wow. Very complex way to get the germs into the bugs and then reproduce them. And so I didn't mention really Fleck. But since you mentioned Przemysl, that's where they met. They both were working in Eisenberg's laboratory for the Austro-Hungarian Empire during World War I. Weigl was, so then after the war, Weigl returned to Lviv as a professor and had his laboratory. Fleck, I mean, it's very interesting. I found the sort of interplay or relationships among sort of Jewish and ethnic Poles, although Weigl actually wasn't an ethnic Pole, but he was Aryan, so he could be an ethnic Pole, essentially. They worked very closely together, and they had many strong relationships, but there was also increasingly in the sort of the Polish Republic between the wars, there was a lot of effort to sort of keep Jewish scientists out of the universities. So Fleck was not able to get a university position, but he had a sort of a flourishing microbiology. He was a physician, and he also had a microbiological sort of analysis laboratory, a private laboratory where doctors all around Lviv and that region would send him samples, so he could, confirm a case of diphtheria in a child or typhus or these various other things, because he had this great skill as a culturer of bacteria.
Yeah. During the war, during the German occupation, of course, at Weigl's laboratory, they produced a lot of vaccines. And of course, they had to employ a lot of louse feeders, so-called. Among them were a lot of Polish intellectuals, Polish and Jewish as well. There is also a very touching story of Henryk and Pola Meisel and their daughter. Meisels were also microbiologists who were employed as researchers by Weigl. And Fleck spent years at concentration camps. What was Block 50?
Right. So I will just briefly account for, all the Jews in Lviv were moved into the ghetto by the Germans when they took over in 1941, and Fleck ended up working in the hospital, the ghetto hospital, and there was a lot of typhus in the ghetto, and he tried to develop his own vaccine. No one really knows if it worked, but it was using the urine of typhus patients to try to extract antigens from it. But so then he ended up at Auschwitz for a period of time, and then at Buchenwald, and this is where Block 50 was. And this was one of the most amazing stories from Buchenwald and from the concentration camps, because he operated in the system. There was a German sort of doctor SS commander named Ding, who was sort of playing both sides of the fence. I mean, he was a opportunistic kind of sleazeball, undereducated, kind of stupid man, but he kind of could see the writing on the wall. And some of the inmates at Buchenwald, who were political prisoners, many of them, some of them communists, some from other political groups, they kind of convinced him that he should go easy on them, and they helped him write these papers, which were published in German medical journals about typhus, and they tried to conceal it. So there was a medical block there, which really became, when it was exposed at Nuremberg at the trials, became one of the bases for sort of establishing rules of medical ethics. This typhus station, Ding and the people working under him would inject patients with typhus germs, and then also they would vaccinate them. They were working with the German military and the SS, who were all competing to try to produce typhus vaccines, because the German soldiers were suffering typhus at the front, at the Eastern Front. And so there was a competition to show, who could produce the most, to impress the Reich by producing vaccine that would protect German soldiers. And at Buchenwald, they had this, ridiculous series of deadly medical experiments where they would vaccinate patients with either Weigl's vaccine or a vaccine made with eggs by a German physician, or there was a Romanian vaccine that was supposedly grown in like dog livers or something. There were all these vaccines from around the world, mostly Europe. They would they would give a prisoner a vaccine, and then they would inject them with blood from a typhus patient, which is not the way you get typhus. And so it's a completely ridiculous way of testing a vaccine. And of course, it never worked, and most of these patients died. And but they wrote up the results, made up the results in some cases. And so this was this thriving enterprise where there was this one block with all the typhus patients. Next door, block 50, where people like where Ding ran the show, this SS commander, and Fleck was one of a group of inmate scientists. These were doctors and scientists from all over Europe who had been taken prisoner and were in the concentration camp system and were brought to this block. And actually, they were making another vaccine there that was based on a French approach that involved growing it in the lungs of immunologically weakened rabbits. And so this is a really amazing thing to visualize. There was this whole basement full of rabbits that would be dipped in cold water. They were like basically tortured, these poor rabbits, to weaken them. And then found that if they did that, they could grow typhus germs in their lungs. And then they would harvest the lungs and somehow make this vaccine, which usually didn't work, but they apparently were able to occasionally make it work. And the scientists there, who were led by sort of the underground and in collusion with the underground in the camp, gave some of the vaccine to people in vulnerable positions, the good vaccine to some people who were in vulnerable positions in the camp. And then the rest of the vaccine went to the German army and was used by the Waffen-SS to no effect, apparently. It was fake. It was like colored water is what I think Fleck called it. And then the rabbits, probably the most important thing of the whole laboratory was that they were supposed to destroy the rabbits after they, killed them to harvest their lungs. But the rabbit flesh was like an essential life-giving food for hundreds, if not thousands of, endangered prisoners in the camp.
So yeah, what did the sabotage mentioned in the title actually consist in?
Well, it's a lot of this is, there's no paper. There's the paper trail on this is very small. There are a few accounts of people who were there. There was a Polish scientist, Marian Szepolowski, I think, Szepolowski, who ended up in New Jersey, and and worked in a hospital there. And I tried to, I talked to somebody who was the guardian of his effects, but they really didn't have anything. He wrote an article or two. They described it as, and then Fleck gave an account of coming into this laboratory and being told when he came into Buchenwald, they had started making this rabbit lung vaccine, and he looked at it and found that what they were claiming, he looked under the microscope, he found that there were these little sort of, cell-like things, and they were convincing themselves that these were typhus germs that had grown in the lungs. He looked at it and he was like, I don't think so. I think those are white blood cells. But they all said, well, don't tell anybody. What do we care? We'll just tell them, So it was very easy to pull the wool over the eyes of the Nazis. They were, we think of them as having had this incredible organizational ability and efficiency, which to an extent, unfortunately, is true. But they were also highly competitive with each other and had a lot of inefficiency and stupidity because, the whole system was their scientific structure was based on toadying up to the leader, not on, intelligence.
Yes. One more thing, maybe, again, in just a few words, very briefly, the life, especially of Rudolf Weigl after the war, not really a happy ending.
Right. No, unfortunately, he was kind of pushed aside. There were both because he had you know, as the director of this laboratory where he had worked, you know, kind of worked for the Nazis or with the Germans. I mean, he had no choice, and in fact, did a great amount to preserve the lives of Polish revolutionaries and intelligentsia. That was could be a strike against him when the communists took over. So he was not like imprisoned, but he was shunted aside, given kind of crummy jobs, taken out of positions of power. And there were competing scientists who were opportunistically kind of moved into his position. And then, so he kind of died without any recognition. And this was something that even when I was writing my book in the 15 years ago or so, he still hadn't really gotten the recognition that he deserved. And there were efforts to put up a plaque in Ukraine, in Lviv, because, you know, this was the home of so many Poles, and including great scientists and mathematicians. And, of course, this sensitive issue. And of course, now I don't even know what the view there is. But, and then Fleck, he went back to Poland. He was a dedicated Pole. I mean, although he was Jewish, and he tried to make it. He was at Lublin University and then Warsaw. In some ways, the atmosphere was better for him because he was more clearly seen as kind of a leftist, and he said good things about communism, I think, initially. And then in 1957, when there was this kind of anti-Semitic movement in the universities, he left and went to Israel for the last few years of his life. He died in 1961.
Mm-hmm. The fantastic laboratory of Dr. Weigl, How Two Brave Scientists Battled Typhus and Sabotaged the Nazis. This is the book. Thank you so much for bringing this story to a wider audience outside Poland. I think here in Poland, we still don't know enough about Rudolf Weigl and Ludwik Fleck. I think it's really worth knowing much more. Thank you.
Let's get a movie. Let's get a movie made, Beata. That's how we should do it, right?
And I was just exactly going to say this. So, Arthur, thank you so much once again for joining me, for writing the book in the first place, for joining me and talking about it.
Thank you so much for your interest.